The colony was quiet at night, too quiet, as if the desert itself held its breath. People locked their doors, shut their windows, and whispered about the creature that lived outside the walls. They called it a monster, an 8-foot alien giant who walked in the shadows and left deep marks in the sand. No one dared to go near the outer caves. Children were warned never to play close to the dunes, and even the guards on the wall avoided looking too long at the empty horizon. It was easier to pretend nothing was there, easier to believe the stories were just stories. But one man did not pretend. His name was Daniel, a human worker who spent his days hauling supplies for the miners and fixing broken machines. He was not strong like a soldier or clever like a scientist, but he had something the others lacked, a restless heart that refused to stay afraid. Every evening after work, Daniel noticed the footprints, huge marks pressed into the ground just beyond the colony lights. They were always fresh, always leading toward the caves. The others muttered about danger, but Daniel felt something else. Curiosity mixed with a strange pull one night. While the desert wind carried whispers through the dust, Daniel stood alone by the outer gate. The colony lights flickered behind him. His hand rested on the steel fence. He should have gone home. He should have closed his door like the others, but instead he stepped outside. The sand crunched under his boots as he followed the trail. Each footprint was so large his entire foot could fit inside it with space left around. He walked slowly at first, then faster, his pulse rising. The air was colder the deeper he went, the dunes stretching like frozen waves under the pale moon. A sound broke the silence, a low growl, or maybe just the wind echoing through stone. Daniel froze, his breath sharp in his throat. Shadows moved near the mouth of the cave, long, heavy, like something alive. He felt the weight of fear press down, every part of him telling him to run. Then he saw them. 2 glowing eyes staring from the darkness. They were not the eyes of an animal. Too sharp, too focused. They burned with thought, with hunger, with something Daniel could not name. His chest tightened. Sweat prickled on his skin. The figure stepped forward, first a hand, massive, with fingers thick as steel rods, then a shoulder broad and scarred. Finally the head, horns broken at the tips, face cut with deep lines of battle. The alien giant stood tall, so tall Daniel felt like a child in front of him. The colony stories had painted him as a beast. But looking at him now, Daniel saw more than that. The giant was powerful, yes, dangerous even, but his movements were not wild, not savage. He did not charge. He did not roar. He only stood half in shadow, half in light. Daniel's heart hammered. His legs trembled, but he did not run. He forced himself to lift his chin and meet those glowing eyes. "I'm not here to fight," he whispered, his voice shaking but steady enough to carry in the quiet night. The giant tilted his head, the gesture strangely human. His breathing was heavy, each sound rolling like thunder in the cave. Daniel could see chains around one of his wrists, broken links hanging loose as if he had torn himself free from something. For a long moment, neither moved. The desert seemed frozen around them. The only sound was the wind carrying sand across stone. Daniel felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for one of them to choose what would happen next. The giant finally shifted, his steps slow, careful, each one shaking the ground. He stopped only a few feet away, towering over Daniel, his shadow swallowing him whole. He lowered his head slightly, not in threat, but in something that felt almost like a plea. Daniel's fear did not vanish, but something new grew stronger inside him. The feeling that this creature was not the monster everyone believed, that there was a story behind those scars, a reason for the chains, a truth no one else had seen. The moment stretched longer and longer. The giant did not attack and Daniel did not flee. They simply stood in the desert night, 2 beings from different worlds, meeting in silence far away back at the colony. Alarms had not sounded. No one knew what Daniel was doing. No one saw him face the shadows. No one saw the bond that was beginning to spark, fragile, dangerous, and powerful. The desert wind howled louder, carrying the promise of danger yet to come, but Daniel did not step back. He stayed rooted to the ground, staring up at the giant, his mind racing, his heart pounding, his fate changing. And in that moment, under the pale light of the moon, the legend of the giant in the shadows began to shift. No longer just a story of fear, but the first chapter of something greater, something that would shake the colony, and perhaps the galaxy itself. Daniel's breath came fast, clouds of air visible in the cold desert night. The alien giant stood before him, a wall of flesh and muscle, yet strangely silent. His glowing eyes locked onto Daniel's every move. One wrong step could mean death, and yet Daniel could not look away. For a moment, the world felt like it had shrunk. The colony lights were distant dots behind him. The stars seemed dimmer above. There was only him, the desert, and the towering figure who looked down at him. Daniel's hands trembled, but he forced himself not to raise them in fear. He remembered something he had once read, that wild animals smell fear. But what if this was not an animal? What if this was someone? The giant tilted his head slightly, the movement slow, deliberate, almost curious. The chains clinked softly around his wrist, the sound strange in the quiet night. Daniel took a cautious step forward, his boots sinking into the sand. "I'm not your enemy," he said quietly, his voice barely louder than the whisper of the wind. The giant's chest rumbled with a sound, low and deep. Not quite a growl, but not words either. Daniel's heart pounded harder, sweat rolling down his back despite the cold. He understood nothing of the sound, but there was no hatred in it. Instead, it felt uncertain, like a question waiting for an answer. Slowly, the alien raised one hand, huge fingers curling, then opening, his palm facing Daniel. It was not an attack, it was a gesture, one Daniel recognized from humans too. An open hand meant peace, meant no weapon was being held. Daniel's throat tightened because in that moment, he realized the giant was trying to communicate. Carefully, Daniel lifted his own hand, holding it up, palm forward, the way soldiers sometimes did when they meant no harm. His hand looked like nothing compared to the alien's massive palm, but the giant's eyes flickered, glowing brighter for a moment as if he understood. The silence stretched, broken only by the desert wind. Daniel felt his heartbeat in his ears. Then slowly, carefully, the giant lowered himself, bending down so his massive frame would not tower as much. Dust swirled around his knees as he crouched, his glowing eyes now level with Daniel's face. Daniel froze, the giant's breath washed over him, warm and heavy, smelling of iron and smoke up close. He could see the scars on the alien's skin, long, deep cuts that had healed into rough lines, each one a story of survival. Around his neck were faint burn marks, like a collar had once been forced on him. The human's fear shifted into something else, pity. No respect this creature had suffered, had fought, had escaped, and yet here he was. Not killing, not raging, but crouching in front of a single human as if waiting to be judged. "I don't know your name," Daniel whispered, his voice almost lost in the wind. "But I think you've been alone for too long." The giant blinked slowly, then leaned forward, his massive head dipping lower. Daniel thought for a terrifying second that the alien would strike, but instead, the giant lowered his forehead until it almost touched Daniel's hand. Not pushing, not forcing, just waiting. Daniel's breath caught. He understood now. This was not just curiosity. This was a request, a silent question. Would the human accept him? Would he see him as something more than a monster? With shaking fingers, Daniel reached out and pressed his hand gently against the giant's forehead, his palm barely covering a fraction of the alien's skin. It was rough and warm, and the moment Daniel made contact, the giant exhaled sharply, a deep, shuddering breath. It felt like lightning surged through the air. Daniel's chest tightened. His mind raced. This was not just a touch. It was a first bond, fragile and strange, but real. Daniel had crossed a line no one else had dared. He had touched the giant in peace. The giant slowly pulled back, his glowing eyes softer now, less fire, more recognition. He stood to his full height again, but did not turn away. Instead, he looked toward the colony in the distance, then back at Daniel, his gaze sharp, questioning. Almost warning, Daniel understood. The giant was hunted, he was hiding. And if Daniel returned to the colony and spoke of this, the soldiers would come with weapons and fire. The alien would be chained again, or killed. Daniel's chest ached at the thought. He realized that he was now holding a secret bigger than anything he had ever known. The giant stepped back into the cave's shadows, his massive form disappearing slowly, but his eyes lingered for a moment longer, glowing like twin stars in the dark. Then even they faded, leaving Daniel alone under the desert sky. He stood frozen for several minutes, his heart still racing, his hand still tingling from the touch. He had expected to die tonight, but instead he had been offered trust or maybe a test.
When Daniel finally turned back toward the colony, he knew everything had changed. He could no longer see the alien giant as a monster. He had looked into his eyes and seen pain, seen loneliness, seen a being that wanted something more, but he also knew the danger. If the colony discovered the truth, fear would twist it into hate. They would never believe the giant wanted peace. They would never believe Daniel's story. To them, he would be a fool, maybe even a traitor. As the gates of the colony came back into view, Daniel's mind raced with questions. What had the giant been through? Who had chained him? Why was he hiding? And why had he chosen Daniel of all people to reveal himself to? The night closed in, and the desert wind whispered across the sand. But Daniel's thoughts were louder. He had made first contact, not with words, not with weapons, but with courage, and that choice would lead him down a path no human had ever walked before. The next morning, Daniel woke before sunrise, his mind still heavy with the memory of the giant's glowing eyes, the touch on his forehead, and the silent bond that had formed in the desert. He tried to convince himself it had been a dream, but the dust on his boots and the sand still clinging to his clothes told the truth. As he walked through the colony streets, he heard whispers. People were already talking. Someone had spotted shapes moving near the outer caves. Guards had found footprints again, bigger than any human could make. The voices were full of fear. Some even demanded the colony council send soldiers to finish the creature once and for all. Daniel kept his head down, his chest tightening with every word. He wanted to shout at them, tell them the giant was not what they thought, but he stopped himself. If he told the truth, they would laugh. Then they would lock him away, or worse, force him to lead them straight to the giant. That day, Daniel worked as usual, hauling tools and repairing machines, but his thoughts were far from his tasks. Every time he tightened a bolt or lifted a crate, his mind drifted back to the cave. He could still hear the heavy breath of the alien, still see the broken chains on his wrist. By evening, Daniel made his decision. He had to see the giant again, not just out of curiosity, but out of something deeper. He needed answers. He needed to know why the alien had lowered his head, why he had shown trust to him of all people. He left the colony quietly after dark, slipping past the guards who were too busy smoking and joking to notice one worker slipping out into the desert. The night air was colder than before, the stars brighter, the footprints still clear, leading the same way. When Daniel reached the cave, he paused, his throat dry. He whispered softly, "I'm here," and waited. For a long moment, nothing moved. The shadows remained still. Then, slowly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from within. The giant appeared once more, towering and silent, his glowing eyes fixed on Daniel. But this time, Daniel noticed something different. The giant was not alone in his silence. Deep scars glowed faintly across his chest, like old wounds still burning. His eyes carried exhaustion, as if he had been hunted for days. Daniel felt a chill. Someone had done this to him recently. Someone was still chasing him. The giant made a low sound, and then, to Daniel's surprise, he gestured deeper into the cave, his massive arm sweeping slowly, inviting Daniel to follow. Every part of Daniel's body screamed not to go in, but he forced his legs to move, step by step, until the darkness swallowed them both. Inside, the cave was wider than Daniel expected. The walls were marked with strange symbols, scratched into stone by massive hands. Some looked like tall towers, others like ships with wings. Daniel could not read them, but he could feel their meaning. This was not just a hiding place, it was a record. At the center, half buried in sand, Daniel saw the remains of something metallic, a piece of armor maybe, or part of a ship, cracked and burned. The giant touched it gently, his huge fingers trembling, and then he let out a deep sound that echoed through the cavern. Not rage, not warning, but grief. Daniel's chest tightened. He understood. The giant had lost something here. Maybe his people, maybe his freedom. He was not just hiding, he was surviving. Daniel looked up at him and whispered, "They hurt you, didn't they?" The giant did not answer in words, but his silence was enough. His scars were enough. The broken chains were enough. Suddenly, a sharp noise echoed from outside. Daniel's blood ran cold. Voices, human voices. The colony patrol had followed the tracks too. Their boots crunched on sand. Their rifles clattered against armor. Daniel turned toward the cave entrance, panic rising. If they found him here with the giant, it would be the end for both of them. The giant's glowing eyes narrowed, his massive frame shifting, ready to fight. But Daniel shook his head desperately, holding his hands up. "No, don't. If they see you, they'll never stop hunting you," he whispered harshly. The giant's gaze locked on him, torn between instinct and trust. Then, slowly, he stepped back into the deeper shadows, his massive form blending into the cave's dark walls. Daniel stood alone at the entrance just as the patrol arrived. "There!" one of the soldiers barked, shining a light on Daniel. "What are you doing out here, worker? Didn't you hear the warnings?" Daniel forced a shaky laugh. I thought I saw something. Just checking, but it's nothing. Shadows and wind," he said, praying his voice sounded convincing. The soldiers muttered, scanning the area with their lights, but none dared go deep into the cave. After a tense moment, they cursed and turned back toward the colony, one of them shaking his head. "Waste of time. Monsters probably run off already." When the sound of their boots faded, Daniel let out the breath he had been holding, his legs weak from the shadows. The giant stepped forward again, his glowing eyes softer now, as if he understood the risk Daniel had just taken for him. For the first time, Daniel felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him. This was no longer just curiosity, no longer just secret meetings in the night. This was a dangerous secret, one that could cost him his life if anyone discovered it. He looked up at the giant, his voice low. "I don't know why you chose me, but I won't betray you." And as the wind howled through the cave entrance, Daniel knew that from this night forward, he carried a secret heavier than any chain. The desert was quiet again, but Daniel's heart was not. Ever since that night in the cave, he felt the weight of two worlds pressing on his shoulders. Inside the colony, the people whispered about the monster growing bolder. Outside in the caves, the giant waited, watching, trusting only him. Days turned into nights, and Daniel carried the secret alone. He worked by day like any ordinary man, fixing machines, carrying crates, listening to the fearful talk of guards and miners. But at night, he slipped away, drawn back to the cave, back to the glowing eyes in the shadows. The bond between them was fragile, built on silence, on gestures, on the single touch they had shared. But with every visit, Daniel saw more. He saw the giant's scars, the broken chains, the way his eyes softened when Daniel came near. It was not just curiosity anymore. It was trust growing slowly in the dark. But trust was dangerous, and one night it was tested. It began with smoke on the horizon, a black column rising above the dunes. Alarms sounded in the colony. Raiders, brutal alien scavengers who struck weak outposts and left nothing behind. People screamed, children were pulled into shelters, soldiers ran to the gates with rifles raised. Daniel stood among the panic, his mind torn. He knew the colony could not withstand a full raid. The raiders were ruthless, burning everything for supplies. The soldiers would fight, but they were outnumbered, and deep inside, Daniel also knew something else. The giant was near. He had felt it in his bones before, that presence in the desert. As the first blasts shook the walls, Daniel ran, not to the shelters like the others, but out toward the edge of the colony. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, but he kept moving until he reached the open dunes, and there, through the rising dust, he saw him. The giant stood on a ridge, massive frame outlined against the firelit sky. His eyes glowed brighter than ever, but he did not move. He was watching, waiting. Daniel stumbled toward him, shouting over the roar of fire and guns. "They'll destroy everything. You have to help us." His voice cracked, fear and desperation mixing together. The giant's gaze narrowed, his chest heaving with heavy breaths. For a moment, Daniel thought he would turn away. Why should he fight for humans who had only called him a monster, who had chained him, hunted him, cursed his name? But Daniel refused to let the silence stand. He stepped closer, his voice trembling but steady. "If you wanted to kill me, you could have done it that first night. You didn't. You showed me trust. Now I'm asking you to trust me again. Please, they'll slaughter everyone." The air was heavy, the desert seemed to hold its breath, and then the giant moved, slowly at first, then wow! With a sudden force, he charged down the dune toward the colony. His steps thundered against the sand. Daniel followed, heart racing. The raiders had broken through the gates. Fire lit the sky. People screamed. But when the giant appeared, towering over everyone, everything stopped. The raiders froze. The soldiers froze. Even the children peeked out from the shelters. No one had expected the monster to arrive. The raiders recovered first, shouting in their alien tongue. They fired their weapons, blasts of fire and plasma striking against the giant's skin. He roared, a sound that shook the very ground, then swung his massive arm, sending raiders flying like rag dolls into the sand. Daniel stood at the gates, his chest tight, watching in awe and fear. The soldiers beside him whispered curses. Some raised their rifles toward the giant. But Daniel shouted, "Stop! He's helping us!" His voice broke with urgency. The giant fought like a storm, every movement precise and brutal, smashing weapons, tearing through enemy lines. Yet he never struck a human, never once turned his fury on the colony he had once stayed away from. At one point, a raider aimed at a child frozen in the street. The shot flew, but before it could hit, the giant moved, shielding the child with his own massive body. The blast burned across his shoulder, but he did not falter. He only growled and crushed the attacker beneath his hand. When the last raiders fled into the night, leaving their dead and broken weapons behind, silence fell over the colony. Smoke drifted, flames crackled, and the people stood staring, half in fear, half in awe. The giant stood at the center of it all, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his wounds, his glowing eyes burning as he looked back at them. Soldiers raised their rifles again, trembling, muttering about finishing him before he turned on them. Daniel's heart pounded. He stepped forward, placing himself between the soldiers and the giant, his voice ringing out. "He saved us. You all saw it. He could have destroyed us, but he didn't. He fought for us." The crowd murmured, doubt heavy in their voices, but no one could deny what they had seen. The giant's scars, his wounds, the child still clinging to his leg, proof enough that the monster was not what they believed. The giant looked down at Daniel, his gaze heavy, unreadable. Then he lowered his head slightly, the same gesture from that first night, a gesture of trust, of recognition. In that moment, Daniel knew their bond had passed the test. It was no longer fragile, no longer hidden in caves. It was forged in fire and blood, before the eyes of an entire colony. But trust, once shown, comes with a price. And Daniel felt it settle on his shoulders like a weight heavier than the desert itself. The soldiers might not kill the giant tonight, but the whispers had already begun. The colony would never see him as one of their own, and Daniel knew the real fight was only just beginning. The colony was quiet after the raid, but not peaceful. People patched broken walls, buried their dead, and whispered about the night when the monster fought for them. Some called it a miracle, others called it a trick. No one agreed, but one thing was certain. The giant was real, and he was no longer just a shadow in the desert. Daniel carried the weight of that night like a stone in his chest. He had stood in front of soldiers, defended the giant, and chosen a side. Now everyone looked at him differently, some with respect, others with suspicion, but Daniel did not care. His mind was elsewhere, on the scars, the glowing eyes, and the silent gesture of trust. That evening, Daniel left the colony again, slipping past the guards, who muttered about patrols. The desert stretched before him, endless and cold. He followed the path he knew by heart now, the footprints still fresh in the sand, and soon the cave loomed ahead. Inside, the giant waited, his massive form half hidden in the shadows, wounds still raw from the battle, blood dried along his arms, yet his eyes glowed steady, fixed on Daniel as if he had been expecting him. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low. "You saved them. You saved us all." The giant did not answer in words, but his chest rumbled with a deep sound, almost like a sigh. Then he turned and walked deeper into the cave, his hand motioning for Daniel to follow. The path twisted through stone until they reached a wide chamber, its walls marked with strange carvings that shimmered faintly in the glow of the giant's skin. Daniel stared, realizing this was not just a hiding place. It was sacred, a place of memory, a place of meaning. At the center of the chamber, the giant knelt, his massive hands pressing against the ground. He drew a line across the stone with one sharp claw, sparks flying as symbols lit up in a circle around them. Daniel stepped back in shock, his heart racing. "What is this?" he whispered. But even as he asked, he felt it. The air was heavy, charged. His skin prickled as if the stone itself was alive. The giant lifted his head, his glowing eyes locked on Daniel, and for the first time, he made a sound that was almost like a word, rough and broken. "Bond." Daniel froze. The word was clear enough, simple, but powerful. His chest tightened as he understood. This was not just about trust anymore. This was about something deeper, something permanent. The giant reached out, his massive hand open, palm facing upward, waiting. Daniel stared at it, fear and awe twisting inside him. He knew what this meant. A bond was not a casual promise. It was a vow that went beyond language, beyond blood. It was forever. Memories rushed through him. The night he had followed the footprints, the moment the giant had lowered his head, the battle where he had shielded a child, the way he had lowered himself before Daniel. Every sign had been leading to this moment. Daniel's hands shook. His mind screamed with questions. What if he said yes? What would happen? What if he said no? Would the giant walk away? Would the fragile trust shatter forever? But when he looked into the alien's glowing eyes, he did not see a monster. He saw loneliness, he saw pain, and he saw the fragile hope of someone who had been abandoned too many times. Daniel swallowed hard, then slowly stepped forward. He placed his small human hand in the giant's palm, the size difference almost laughable, his entire hand barely covered by one of the alien's fingers. But the moment their skin touched, the circle on the ground flared with light. The carvings on the walls glowed brighter, and a hum filled the chamber. Daniel gasped. It was as if the cave itself was alive. The light wrapped around them both, symbols crawling across the giant's skin, glowing brighter with every heartbeat. And then, to his shock, faint lines of light appeared on his own hand too. The bond was not one-sided. It was shared. He felt warmth rush through him, not painful, but overwhelming. Emotions not his own filled his mind. Rage, grief, strength, but also loyalty, respect, and something that felt almost like hope. He stumbled, but did not pull away. The giant's chest rumbled again, his glowing eyes softer now. He lowered his head until his forehead touched Daniel's hand, sealing the ritual, and when he pulled back, the glow remained faint on Daniel's skin, a mark no one could see unless they looked closely. Daniel's breath shook as he whispered, "What have we done?" But inside, he already knew the answer. They had created something that no colony law, no alien raid, no weapon could ever break. The giant leaned back, his massive chest rising and falling. Then, slowly, he spoke again, rough and heavy, but clear enough to make Daniel's heart stop. Together. Daniel closed his eyes, his throat tight. Together, yes. That was the truth of it now. His life was no longer his own. It was tied to the giants. Their bond was more than survival. It was destiny. Outside the cave, the desert wind howled, carrying whispers of the colony's fear. Whispers of the raiders who would surely return. Whispers of soldiers who would never accept what had just happened. But inside the cave, in the glow of the bond ritual, Daniel felt something new. For the first time in his life, he was not alone, and neither was the giant. The bond had changed everything. Daniel felt it in his bones, in the strange warmth that lingered on his hand, where the light had marked him. He could feel the giant now, not with words, but with something deeper, a pulse in his mind, a quiet presence that reminded him he was no longer alone. For a few days, Daniel carried the secret like treasure. He worked among the people, listening to their fears and anger, but every night he returned to the cave, and the giant was there, silent but steady, watching him with eyes that no longer burned with suspicion, but with recognition. But the colony was not blind. Rumors spread quickly. Some swore they had seen Daniel walking beyond the gates. Others whispered that the monster followed him, shadows on the dunes that moved when Daniel disappeared. Suspicion grew, and suspicion is dangerous when fear is already there. One evening, as Daniel repaired a broken water pump near the colony gates, two soldiers approached, their faces hard, their voices sharp. "The council wants you," one said, gripping his arm too tightly. Daniel tried to ask why, but their silence was answer enough. In the council chamber, the leaders sat in a circle, their robes clean, their faces cold. "You were seen outside the walls," one said. "You returned late, and when raiders struck, you appeared from the desert, not from the shelters. Explain yourself." Daniel's mouth went dry. His heart raced. He tried to answer carefully. I was scouting. I wanted to see if the monster was real," he said, but the council members exchanged dark looks. One of them leaned forward, eyes sharp. "And did you find it?" Daniel hesitated, just for a second, but that second was enough. "He hesitated," the counselor hissed. "He knows something." Before Daniel could defend himself, the chamber doors slammed open. A soldier stumbled in, blood on his armor. "Raiders!" he shouted. "They're back, stronger this time!" Chaos erupted. The council scrambled. Orders were shouted. Soldiers ran, but eyes still lingered on Daniel, suspicion unshaken. That night, the desert burned again. Raiders poured across the dunes, their weapons spitting fire. The colony walls shook. People screamed. Daniel pushed through the panic, his only thought clear. The giant. He had to find him. They had bonded, and now they were one. He slipped out of the gates, racing across the sand, the bond pulsing stronger with every step. And then he saw him, the giant already striding toward the colony, his glowing eyes fierce, his wounds from the last battle barely healed, yet his steps steady. Daniel reached him, breathless. "They're inside already," he gasped. "We have to stop them." The giant gave a low growl, a sound of agreement, and together they ran, the battle which was as brutal. Fire lit the sky, soldiers fought, but they were overwhelmed. Daniel stuck close to the giant, shouting warnings, pointing out attackers. The giant fought like a storm, tearing through raiders, protecting every life he could. But then it happened. Betrayal. From the colony walls, human soldiers raised their rifles, not at the raiders, but at the giant, fear and anger twisting their minds. "Kill it now," one shouted, "before it turns on us." Daniel spun, his heart stopping. "No, he's saving you," he screamed, but his voice was drowned by the crack of rifles. Bullets and plasma bolts streaked through the night, striking the giant's back, his chest, his legs. The giant roared, stumbling, his massive body crashing into the sand. Daniel ran to him, his hands shaking as he pressed against the giant's wounds. No, stay with me," he begged. The bond burned in his mind, sharp with pain. The raiders cheered at the sight, thinking their enemy was falling. But the giant rose again, blood dripping from his wounds, his glowing eyes blazing with fury. He fought harder, crushing attackers, even as human fire struck him from behind. Daniel turned on his own people, his voice breaking. "Stop, you fools! He's the only reason you're still alive." But the soldiers did not listen. Fear had already made them blind. The battle raged. Blood soaked the sand. Human and raider alike fell. And at the center of it all was the giant, roaring, bleeding, fighting, until the last raider lay broken, silence finally settling over the smoking ruins. Daniel knelt beside him, tears streaking his face. The giant collapsed onto one knee, his massive body trembling, his hand pressed against the ground to hold himself steady, glowing eyes dimmer now, but still locked on Daniel. The soldiers surrounded them, rifles raised, voices harsh. "Step away from it, Daniel," one barked. "This ends now." Daniel stood, his small frame a barrier between them and the giant, his arms spread wide, his voice shaking but strong. "If you want him, you'll have to go through me." The soldiers hesitated. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some saw the truth in Daniel's eyes. Others only saw betrayal. The counselor pushed forward, his voice like ice. "You've betrayed your own kind for a beast." Daniel's voice cracked, but he did not move. "He is not a beast," he shouted. "He's more human than any of you tonight." The soldiers wavered, torn between orders and doubt. The giant's chest heaved, his blood soaking the sand. Yet still, he reached out, his massive hand resting gently against Daniel's shoulder, a gesture of trust even in the face of death. That night, the colony did not see a monster. They saw betrayal and blood. They saw a human who stood against his own people, and a giant who refused to fall. But deep inside the cave of Daniel's heart, he knew the truth. The bond was real, And no bullet, no betrayal, no counsel could break it. Not now, not ever. The battlefield was silent at last, smoke drifting in the cold desert wind. The colony walls cracked and burned, the sand soaked with blood. Bodies of raiders and soldiers lay side by side, but no one moved. All eyes were fixed on the giant, kneeling in the dirt, his massive frame trembling, his glowing eyes dim with pain. Daniel stood in front of him, his arms spread, his body a shield against the rifles still aimed at the wounded alien. His voice raw from shouting. He saved you. He fought for you. If you kill him now, you kill the only reason this colony still stands. The soldiers wavered, their hands shaking on their weapons. Some looked at each other with doubt. Others scowled with fear. And then the counselor stepped forward, his voice sharp and cold. A monster is still a monster. It may fight today, but tomorrow it will turn on us. Finish it now, before it destroys us all. Daniel's chest tightened with anger. He stepped closer, his eyes blazing. You call him a monster? He shielded your children. He bled for your homes. He fought harder for this colony than any of your soldiers ever did, he shouted, his voice carrying through the broken streets. The giant's hand, bloodied and heavy, reached out and touched Daniel's shoulder gently. A reminder of their bond. Daniel felt the pulse of it in his bones, the warmth of connection. He could feel the giant's pain, but also his calm, his acceptance, as if telling Daniel that whatever happened now, he was not alone. Whispers spread through the crowd. A child's voice broke the silence, trembling, but loud enough to be heard. He saved me, the boy said, stepping out from behind his mother, his tiny hands gripping the cloth of her dress. The monster saved me. The people gasped, heads turned, and Daniel seized the moment, his voice steady now. Not a monster, not a beast, a warrior, a protector, he said, his voice softer but stronger. And he is bonded to me, to us. You kill him, you kill me too. The soldiers froze, their rifles lowering just slightly. No one dared fire. The bond was visible now, glowing faint lines across Daniel's hand, marks faint but undeniable, proof of something greater than fear. The counselor's face twisted with rage, but he saw the tide shifting, his power slipping. He spat words like venom. You'll regret this, both of you. But even his voice shook with doubt. Slowly, the giant pushed himself to his feet, towering over everyone, his wounds still bleeding, his body unsteady, but his eyes glowed again. Brighter now, not with fury, but with strength. He looked down at Daniel, then at the colony, and lowered his head, the same gesture of trust he had shown that first night in the desert. Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm. You all feared him, but fear blinded you. He is not our enemy, the raiders are. The galaxy is full of enemies who will not hesitate to tear us apart. But him, he chose us. He chose to fight for us, and I chose him. The people stared, silent, torn between the fear of what they had always believed and the truth their own eyes had seen. Some lowered their weapons, others looked away, unable to meet the giant's gaze. Finally, one soldier stepped back, lowering his rifle completely. Then another followed, until only a handful remained frozen, caught between orders and conscience. The tide had shifted, and the counselor knew it. That night, the giant did not stay within the colony walls. He returned to the desert, but this time, he was not alone. Daniel walked beside him, their bond unbroken, their steps steady. The stars above seemed brighter, as if the universe itself was watching. The whispers spread across the colony like fire. Some still called him a monster. Others began to call him protector. And Daniel, the foolish worker who once followed footprints into the dark, was now seen as something more, a man who had chosen to stand beside the impossible. Days later, when raiders gathered again on the horizon, they hesitated, for the stories had already reached them. Stories of the human who bonded with a giant. Stories of blood and fire, of trust and betrayal. Stories that made even hardened warriors shiver. The colony would never be the same. The bond had changed everything, not just for Daniel and the giant, but for all who had witnessed it. Fear had cracked, and through that crack, something new had entered. Respect, awe, maybe even hope, as Daniel stood on the ridge beside the alien giant, the desert wind whipping around them. He knew this was only the beginning. The galaxy was wide, full of enemies and dangers, but also full of chances. And together, the brave and the bonded, they would face it all. The giant lowered his head once more, a silent vow, and Daniel whispered back, "Together," his voice steady, his fear gone, replaced by something stronger than any weapon, stronger than any chain. The colony behind them, the stars above them, the desert before them, two figures walked side by side, no longer outcast and worker, no longer monster and man, but bonded forever.